very much, Amy. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much to everybody for being here today, including those of you who are joining the recording. Really pleased to be here with you guys today to talk about the interpretive description qualitative approach. So I'll just say that I'm very much a novice researcher, really in the conceptualization phase of my research. So I in no way claim to be an expert about interpretive description. And you'll hear me interchangeably refer to it as ID, just out of convenience. But since I learned about ID, it's an approach to qualitative research that really resonates with me. And hopefully after today's session, some of you might gain further interest in it as well. And you might consider using it to answer your own burning applied disciplinary questions. So I'll just click my next slide. So as is right to do, I just want to get started off by a few acknowledgements. First off is to Dr. Sally Thorne, who is the author of the ID approach. And she has generously given some of her time to answer some of my questions via email. And a lot of our email exchanges certainly helped me in my own understanding of this approach. Second, to Dr. Holly Etchegary, who of course is academic lead with NL support. And she invited me here today, and I'm quite appreciative of that opportunity. Also to my supervisor, Dr. April Pike, who first introduced me to ID and said that, I think this is a method you'll like working with. She probably regrets the ID, I guess, Frankenstein monster that she created, going around quoting Sally Thorne all day, every day. But nonetheless, I remain appreciative. And of course, to all of you today for your time and interest. So I might just stop sharing now, just so. Okay, nope, gotta go back. So I had my objectives on another slide, but I'll just see if I can go back. I'll just add here with the preface that, as Amy mentioned, I am a nurse. And so therefore my angle of vision that I have as a nurse will be evident as I'm presenting the examples and explanations. And this is an approach that's rooted in the nursing discipline, but it is an approach that's really applicable to all applied health and really all applied disciplines. So on my next slide that you have here, not to belabor the point, but because I'm sure this was beautifully covered by Dr. Etchegary in last week's Intro to Qualitative webinar, but we use qualitative methods in healthcare to really get at that understanding of how humans experience health, illness, and health and wellness care. So, and we know that that's quite complex to get at that, and we know that people experience those multiple subjective realities. So qualitative research really gives us that rich point of entry to really capture those experiences and to give voice to the participants, as well as, meaning to that phenomenon of interest. And it lets us do that in ways that you can't get at with quantitative data. So sometimes we use qualitative to capture this, or as a way to explain quantitative findings that explain those findings with that, capture that human essence. So when health researchers really started doing qualitative research, they drew on the methods that were available at the time, which were largely derived from the social science. So here, and you'll hear me refer to these as the conventional qualitative methods. So these are the three key players. And if you're familiar with health research, you've probably seen these used before. You've encountered studies that use these methodologies. So ethnography, for example, comes from the discipline of anthropology, and really was used it was developed to document human variation for the point of capturing what is universal about being human. Grounded theory originates in sociology, and really that was interested in understanding human behavior and how that human behavior is manifest in social processes. There's also phenomenology, and that was really rooted in psychology. And their psychologists were really interested in getting into those essence of the lived human experience as manifest in the human mind. So as you can see, these methods originate within the realms of the human philosophical curiosity, really. And so because of that, research that religiously follows these methods tends to be quite adherent and grounded in the theoretical versus the practical. So what's wrong with conventional? And as you can see there on my slide, I said nothing really, but because there has been beautiful and impactful health research that's been conducted that use these conventional social science methods. And I want to be clear that I'm in no way discrediting these studies. So I'm going to say we'll revisit this idea at the end of the webinar, and I'll do that by sharing a conversation I had with the author of ID. But until this point, I kind of want to switch gears and focus on why I think that ID is really a useful alternative to some of these quote unquote conventional social science methodologies. So we have to get at the understanding that in ID, we are considering the health disciplines to be applied disciplines. So when we say applied disciplines, we mean they're disciplines like education, nursing, social work, medicine. These are all examples, but not limited to that. And they have they exist for the purpose of doing something practical in the world. So they meet a practical need in society. And because of that, we have a different relationship to knowledge than things that are purely theoretical, okay? So those are quite different than social science, like I said, that originate out of human philosophical curiosity. So it's not enough for us just to understand a phenomenon, but it has to be understood within its practice context in order to influence practice outcomes. And one of the main reasons why we have that different relationship with knowledge is because of what you'll hear Thorne refer to as our disciplinary hardwiring. So I'm going to talk about my own practice background and my own, I guess, hardwiring as a nurse to sort of illustrate this. But when I say this, I'd invite you, if you come from a different discipline, to think about your own disciplinary hardwiring. So, and Brenda's here with me. Brenda worked with me on gynae, and I'll talk about my practice background as a gynecology surgery nurse. And I'd always look at the patients before me as a series of wholes and parts in interaction. So yes, I had taken care of hundreds of hysterectomy patients, and I could sort of anticipate the patterns of a standard, what is the clinical trajectory of a hysterectomy patient? So, but I also never just looked at that patient as just a hysterectomy. Based on my clinical training, based on my education, I'm hardwired to go back and forth between that hysterectomy, the person as a biological whole, as well as that person as an individual. So what ideas and interpretations do they bring that I need to be mindful of when making my clinical judgment? So for example, a patient might come to me, maybe they have severe distrust in Western medicine, maybe this was not a planned surgery. Perhaps this is somebody who has a terrible amount of experience with surgeries, and they have a very explicit idea of how their recovery should look like. So it's going between all those wholes and parts where I make my clinical judgment. So while I would draw on patterns and commonalities to inform my actions as a nurse, I would also be called to remain attuned to those experiences of patients that maybe falls outside of the mean, and it would call me to adjust my practice accordingly. So as you can see, that kind of calls into a different relationship with knowledge based on my disciplinary hardwiring, how I'm hardwired to look at things.
But then there's something.
Am I hearing something? Okay, you could go. So when health researchers started doing qualitative research, well, there was a bit of pushback, I'll be quite honest. And this research was seen as soft. And to be honest, when you're comparing it to that hard, quantifiable biomedical data. And frankly, these ideas about value hierarchy in research still exist. And for some reason, qualitative research seems to still be sort of lower on the bottom of the pyramid, though we do see that's kind of changing. So there was resistance there from the biomedical community, but also the social scientist communities didn't necessarily take too kindly to health researchers who were taking up this method. The way they saw it, health researchers were saying, oh, well, I did a doctoral course. And they were saying, well, that doesn't make you a social scientist. And then they would accuse us sometimes of either method slurring or doing sloppy science. So what happened was, to ward off that criticism, health researchers said, well, I'm going to follow the methodological rules of the social science so meticulously that this will be such a high quality study that nobody can possibly call its rigor or its quality into question. And this is where we ran into trouble, because this is where we're, I guess, sliding off our disciplinary hardwiring And the result was that some of the research was a bit problematic. So we were over-essentializing claims. So for example, in phenomenology, you'll hear people say, this is the lived experience. And that makes tremendous sense when you're looking at getting at that untarnished essence of human experience. But for nursing, we know that this is one person, this is how some people experience things, and we wouldn't emphasize that. Or on the other hand, they'd say with a general caveat, well, I did this study, but I can't really transfer it beyond these 10 to 12 people who are interviewed. Well, then that begs the question of why bother doing the research at all? So this is where we kind of, ran into issues. And this visionary woman is Dr. Sally Thorne. And it was Dr. Sally Thorne who really first drew our attention to this and why the social science methods weren't working for the applied disciplines. And she said, maybe it's time to let go of our death grip on these rule structures, and not out of laziness, but because they are limiting our ability to conduct research that meets the needs of our applied disciplines. So Dr. Thorne is actually a professor of nursing at the University of British Columbia, and she's the author and developer of the interpretive description approach. And she describes it as an approach, or rather even an attitude towards doing good qualitative research for applied disciplines. And she's presented this in one of her webinars, and I'm just going to touch on the phenomenology one in particular, because I already kind of spoke about the inconsistencies with our disciplinary hardwiring. But we'll look at the example of phenomenology. So a commonly used technique in phenomenology is bracketing. So that's when the researcher brackets all their preconceptions and everything that they know, because they don't want to tarnish those essence of the human experience. And of course, that makes tremendous sense in the context of psychology. But really, in nursing, we're looking to build upon our disciplinary knowledge, and we're looking to advance our knowledge and make it usable. And so we don't really want to be, reinventing the wheel every time. So this was Dr. Thorne's solution, and this image here is her book cover, and it's in its second and current edition. I'm a little biased, but I think it's a wonderfully digestible, it's an insightful read, it's a bit humorous at times, and it gives lots of practical tips for anybody interested in conducting qualitative interviews, as well as how to disseminate your findings to wider audience. So definite 10 for me. And in the next slide, I'm just going to show you about a little brief timeline that led to the development of interpretive description. So she didn't give a timeline, but Dr. Thorne said that many years ago, she had attended this workshop, and it was 50-50 health researchers and the social scientists. And she said that this is really where it really became sort of palpable, these really polarizing aims between health researchers and social scientists. One very much interested in developing that clinical knowledge, and others very much with theorizing. And this is when she became aware of it. So she started to think about it a bit more. And in 1991, she published a critical examination in the journal Qualitative Health Research, and where she discussed, some of those schisms between the social scientists and the nurse. She was referring to nursing. Like I said, this approach is rooted in the discipline of nursing. And she suggested then, perhaps somebody might take this on as to develop a method that's suited to us. So by 1997, she said that idea must have stuck, because she had published a manuscript in Research in Nursing and Health. And she was working with two of her graduate students at the time, who she said showed great aptitude for this work. And this is when the term interpretive description was coined. The funny thing was, she never really intended to develop a methodology. She didn't really even need to give it a title, but when she said interpretive description, what she meant was not grounded theory, not phenomenology, not ethnography. So she published more criteria for data analysis. By 2008, she had produced the first edition of interpretive description. And in a literature review that was published in 2021, they did a literature review looking at the studies that had drawn on the method, and they found 2,203 studies that either in the abstract or the title used interpretive description. 3/4 of those that had actually been used within the last 5 years. So we know that the approach is definitely, there's more uptake of the approach for sure. So when you might use ID, and this is a direct quote from the book, is that when you're getting at those something related to patterns within the realm of human experience. So those patterns could be human behavior, activity, perceptions, or ideas. And there needs to be evidence that what we would call actors in the field, so whoever you're going to collect your data from, that they have that experiential access that has not yet been sufficiently documented, described, or interpreted, and that knowledge could be usable to practice. It's also important to know when you wouldn't use ID, and there are times when ID might not be right for you. So one if you're looking for a very prescriptive approach. Dr. Thorne has said, qualitative research works best for people with a high tolerance for ambiguity. So if the ambiguity of that caused you distress, ID is probably not for you, because it allows the researcher a great deal of creativity if they can justify their design selections to orientate the study towards that relevant usable knowledge. If you're seeking pure description, interpretive description probably isn't for you either. So if, for example, if you're getting at the who, what, when, and where, and keeping it very close to the participants' words and not really venturing far from that. Now, and there are times in research when that is definitely applicable and when you should do that. And there are methods that will help you do that, qualitative descriptive being one of them. But in ID, we're always going beyond that to get interpretation and always staying grounded in, so what does that mean to patient care? And also, if your end goal is to develop a theory, ID probably isn't for you, because theory can certainly be used as a tool in ID, but is never the end goal. And we never assume that the knowledge that we're developing today will even hold true, as our disciplines evolve and as we add those further layers of complexity. So as per the title, ID seems to sort of get housed with the so what. And I think this method in particular is very consistent with the aims of CIHR and the NL support, because these organizations do put a big emphasis on knowledge translation. And knowledge translation is built into the design of the ID study. We are always, well, this is important because it costs money to do research, and there should be some evidence that this is going to be relevant and usable. So we always keep grounded in, so what does this mean to the practice world of healthcare? And the knowledge translation is really, it's really achieved through my next slide, which is the theoretical scaffolding. So this is a key concept in ID, and it's been previously referred to, like in earlier publications, she calls it the analytic framework. But basically what that means is that we can situate the rationale for our study within what is known in the literature, including the gaps, and informal and clinical knowledge. So, in the example of nursing, what ideas or what arguments are in vogue in nursing right now? And as well as that disciplinary epistemology but we'll call it disciplinary hardwiring for the purpose of today. So in an ID study, that theoretical scaffolding, that is a sufficient rationale to justify your study. You don't have to draw on any theories. You can, but that theoretical scaffolding from start to finish of our study keeps us grounded in, I guess, why we went in to conduct this research in the first place. Oh, I could go back to that. There we go. So that's not to say that you can't use theory in ID. You certainly can. ID and other quote unquote generic methods sometimes get pigeonholed into being atheoretical, and I would take great exception with that. So Dr. Thorne says that if we all to drawing on a particular theory, we run the risk of missing something else. So there's things that theory privileges and things that it obscures. And for example, interpretive phenomenology. And when a lot of times when we do the interpretive phenomenology, we reference the hermeneutics. So which is a theory and methodology of interpretation. But maybe the assumptions under that are drawing our attentions to some things and obscuring other things that might be relevant to the inquiry. So in ID, we sort of have that liberty to use the techniques, and this is sort of what's represented in my image here, to use the techniques without being bagged down by all that theoretical baggage. It also might be more useful in an ID study to think about the multitude of theories that could be driving a study or influencing our vision on it. And to be honest, that sort of more closely mirrors how it is, at least in my discipline, when I think of the example of when I taught my first year students, and I introduced them to this theory known as the Peplau's interpersonal relationships theory. That's a beautiful little theory. And, you know, as first years learning about interpersonal communications, very useful. But I'm not disillusioned to thinking that this one theory that I gave them is the end all be all for the rest of their careers. You know, they might draw on it at certain times, and certainly there are practice situations where it's more applicable than others. So just to keep that in mind, and it's nice to have this liberty that sort of more closely aligns to how things are in nursing practice. So the idea of what's in a name. So as I mentioned before, we go beyond that pure description, and this is when we're going to get into the interpretation. So we want to see those patterns and associations and relationships with the phenomenon. But, and this is how, even in the name, ID is drawing a bit on that hermeneutics, right? But without full-fledged adherence to the methodology. But this concept of illumination that you see in the slide, it's not that ID findings will necessarily give you something that's, wow, mind-blowing, like enigmatic, like I never, but it shines a light on something that perhaps we hadn't brought into our consciousness that resonates with those of us in the applied field and can be used to inform practice. And if an ID study does that, then it's done its job. It's done correctly. So one of the questions I asked Dr. Thorne, I said to her, you know, like, what's an example of a textbook study that's just like a beautiful ID study? And she said, well, you know, she politely reminded me that since it's not a prescriptive approach, it's not really, it becomes challenging to answer that question. So what really, and perhaps that question is not even relevant for that reason. So really the idea, what is more relevant is what is a good question? And ID questions are framed slightly different than well, not slightly, quite different than the traditional social science. So in phenomenology, again, we'd say, what is the lived experience of? But interpretive description, we might use things such as what is happening here? What can be learned from? I love that particular one. And when I do go into my research, like I said, I'm very much in the conceptual phase, but what can be learned from patients' perceptions of the nursing role in providing genomic care, just as an example. And here are some other examples that and I would invite you to, if you are interested in this approach, to look at how some questions in the literature have been phrased. So going on sampling, and like I told you, you have some leeway with ID in selecting your sampling. Purposive sampling, we'd be using that to sort of target participants who represent the phenomenon of interest and also to ensure maximum variation. Convenience sampling is often used when we're recruiting a group of people who are closest at hand. So perhaps if we were recruiting patients from a single site at the hospital who were with our affiliate institution, we were conducting the research, things like that. And convenience sampling works particularly well when you're in the early stages of documenting the phenomenon, so maybe not a whole lot is known. And then there's also theoretical sampling, which is strongly related to grounded theory. There's, you know, obviously you have some idea of who you're going to recruit going into it, but there is no preset notion or of who to recruit or any predetermined groups. You collect data and analyze from data, and you continue to go there with your sampling until you've saturated your theory, really. And I think this is an important point to note, that true data saturation, according to Thorne, may never be achieved. It could be, and it might not even be a desirable thing, because we know that this can often be used as what she calls a hollow language signifier to indicate, when to, okay, yeah, I saturated the data, so then I stopped collecting data. But really, we know that there's infinite variation. So what really is more relevant is, what have you been able to discern on the basis of his exposures that warrants what you reported in your study? So just to keep that in mind, because data saturation is often really sort of like an important category when you're talking about quality, but Thorne kind of posed the idea that maybe it shouldn't be. So in terms of data collection, it probably doesn't come as any surprise, based on what I've been talking about, that data sources are eclectic in ID. So they draw on different methods and different research methodologies. Semi-structured interviews tends to be preferred, just because it's a perfect way to capture essences of human subjectivity. Think about nurses. We always wish that we had more time to sort of sit and discuss with our patients. But I just want to make the point that researchers have leeway in deciding what data they can collect, as long as A, it aligns with the research question and also with your knowledge goals as an applied discipline. So you can also draw on multiple sources in the study, and you can kind of decide as you go along as well. So then there's data analysis. Again, this is not a very prescriptive thing. Thorne says you do have to code. And when I'm talking about coding, what I mean is it's not computer coding, but when you're taking those bits of data, almost like bits of laundry, and you're sorting them into your laundry baskets, so the data is manageable. And you need to do that, because absolutely, if it's not in those manageable bits, you're just going to become completely overwhelmed. So you do have to code somewhat. And I'll touch on that again with the limitations of that, but some amount of coding is required in ID. Constant comparative analysis. This is actually rooted in grounded theory. And I noticed that a lot of the studies that Thorne actually does, she draws on this method. And this is the idea that you're constantly comparing your data back and forth between all your data to consider what might be similar, what might be different, to really theorize those relationships among the data. And considering we're looking for patterns in ID, this approach works quite well. Thematic analysis, again, she puts warrants on this, but I have seen a lot of ID studies that have used thematic analysis. So they draw on methods such as Braun and Clark, or things like that, to analyze your data. And there are others that I haven't listed there, but just to sort of give you an idea. So this is Thorne's quote on coding. So she's saying that staying over long in the microscopic view of the trees has a tendency to blur one's perspective of the forest. So here she's cautioning us, like, do not prematurely code your data, because this can disconnect you from the overall purpose of your study. So keep in mind, what is the overall picture? What am I learning about this? Because she says it can lead to, and I quote, bloodless findings. So just keep in mind, you're always looking at the overall picture. And that's this is really one of the big rationales why she developed this method. So people wouldn't be, coding so much to the point that interpretation becomes impossible for our purposes. And again, Thorne published a editorial in 2020, and it was a really provocative editorial where she said, like, a lot of what is in the nursing discipline represents dumbed down science, because she says telling your reader that you found 3 themes and 14 categories and then going on briefly to describe them is hopelessly insufficient. So, themes and taxonomies in our data reporting is not the end goal. And there should be a compelling account that there was a purpose in extracting your themes in order to generate an understanding, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to list my themes, here's my themes, and here's a quote that supports it. Okay, so it should be a process of genuine discovery. And I have it written here, with in-depth interrogation of the data, reflection on the interrelationships, explanation of the interpretations, and insightful and evocative reporting of your findings. So it really does call on us to really really get back to our epistemological roots, if you will. So in qualitative data, and really in any scientific study that you're doing, it's always a question of rigor. So how do you ensure that the product you're making has quality? And this becomes a very important consideration. There are many guidelines in the publication about how to assess the rigor of a study. So Thorne sort of has a different take on this, surprise, surprise, about how to critique the quality of a qualitative study. And she says here that, don't be fooled into thinking that because you followed a checklist and guidelines that somehow your product, is a good product for your discipline. So I think this is a really important quote where she focuses, this comes from the book, where she focuses on purpose, process, and context. So some things become highly subjective or highly technical criteria for assessing the worth of a qualitative study, but really what we should be focused on more squarely is matters of purpose, process, and context. The key to quality will inevitably be found within the internal logic that aligns those three elements into a coherent and convincing account. And Thorne sort of developed her own, even though you'll hear a lot talking about transferability, dependability as criteria that are often used to critique qualitative studies. And you can sort of see the similarities in what I'll talk about, but in her book, she explicitly outlines these four. One being epistemological integrity. So this is the idea that our research process should line up with our research question, and it should be consistent with our disciplinary hardwiring, like I talked about, and that the sources of data and the strategies for interpreting the data, there should be a logical flow between all of those things. Second is the idea of representative credibility. So that's how a researcher shows how much that the findings that you arrived at are consistent with the way you sampled the phenomena. So if I came out with some outrageous claims based on a phenomenological single case study, there would be some similar, that would call the representative credibility into question in my mind. So analytic logic, this is the idea that the claims you are making, there's a clear line from what you learned through the process of data collection analysis. So this is really ensured by a really good audit trail. Maybe you'll have some memoing, some notes where you take a little note on the side, like, how is it that I know what I know? So a very strong audit trail ensures the analytic logic to make sure that what you're saying lines up with what you found. And I think closely related to that concept is the idea of interpretive authority. So we want assurance that the research is trustworthy. Okay, and obviously, as I mentioned, where we are nurses or whatever discipline, our disciplinary hardwiring that we're looking at it, we are going to have some influence on the way we go about that research. But we have to account for that. We're not going to suspend it completely. It's inevitable to avoid all bias, but we do have to be considering how it's affecting how we're interpreting things. So we need to make sure that the findings that we find do illustrate something external to us, and we're not just sort of presupposing them on existing convenient structures. So that's maybe just different words to describe. You can see that it mirrors, if anyone's familiar with criteria for qualitative reporting, there are some overlap. In the book, Thorne does also mention that she talks about the beyond evaluation criteria in ID. And so in addition to those four that I just mentioned, she says that there are other ways to critique qualitative products that take into consideration the larger disciplinary, social, and historical context. So try and go through this quickly, but moral defensibility. So that's the idea that, well, we know that we certainly with an ethical process of the research, and obviously you'd have to get ethics review before you even began a study, there has to be some convincing claim that why we are going in to to collect this knowledge will benefit some people, because, especially when you're conducting research with vulnerable groups, vulnerable populations, like we said, we can't eliminate risk or harm completely, but we try to minimize it. So you need to really have a strong moral convincing claim as to why this knowledge is needed. So the idea of disciplinary relevance, and I have seen that Thorne drew on an example. This was a study, it was a bit of a cringy study really, written in 1991. It talked about career women with tattoos. And then she said, you know, like, how does that really, how can I use, you know, and obviously it's dated now, but how can that be used to really advance nursing knowledge? So it does have to be, it has to be clear that it's relevant to your discipline. Pragmatic obligation, that's the idea that the way we report our data should be reported in a way as if these findings would indeed be applicable in practice. So when we talked about the beyond theming, it's not sufficient just to report themes. You have to explain how these themes can be used in your practice. Contextual awareness. So this is the idea that really it's just an acknowledgement that many of our understandings and our constructions are they're just that, they're socially constructed, subject to multiple realities. They're not infallible, and they may be subject to change, and they may not stand the test of time. And then finally, which I would argue is also closely related to that, our research should get at what is a probable truth. So we know that realistically an absolute truth in ID really isn't possible. So what we're trying to arrive at is the idea that we have the best truth until it's otherwise, you know, we have some reason to abandon that idea of it as being the probable truth. Yeah, so I spoke a lot just now, but I think what actually might be helpful now is to go into, just to give an example. So this is an example of an ID study. And this is one that Dr. Thorne co-authored herself. And it's the idea of helpful communications during the cancer diagnosis period. And it's an interpretive description of patient preferences. So I want to sort of, through this example, show the design logic and how it aligns with disciplinary hardwiring, analytic logic, all those type things. So here, we have a clear purpose. So the purpose is to contribute to evidence-informed cancer communication. How are we going to do this? Through documenting the perceptions of patients, so who have that patients in the early stages with cancer, about their experiences and about what they found helpful from health professionals during the period of their cancer diagnosis, so that this can inform future actions for healthcare providers to take. So again, if you look here, this makes tremendous sense, conducting semi-structured interviews, getting at that in-depth human account of the experience of newly diagnosed with cancer. Fairly new study, they use convenience sampling from different cancer treatment centers. And if you look, this is an example of one of the semi-structured sample questions. Have there been times in your cancer experiences so far that professional patient communication has been most helpful? What was it that made that particular communication so helpful for you? Again, we're understanding the phenomenon within its practice context. So to ensure the quality, Thorne engaged in constant comparative analysis. So being aware of how the values and the opinions affected the process, and then looking at the how going back and forth between the data, looking at the different periods of cancer communication. Does it change over time when you're looking at themes of people who might have had their diagnosis in a longer period? How does that evolve? In terms of reflexivity, this is aware of how your values, opinions, and experiences affect the process and outcomes of the research. You know, if you were involved in cancer care, that's probably going to affect how you interpret that data. As well as keeping that good audit trail so we can keep in mind how it was that we interpreted this data and those findings. This is just an example. And I spoke earlier about the concept of illumination. And I think this becomes really clear in this study. So this is a verbatim quote from that study that I just referenced. And this goes back to what I'm saying. It's not that the findings are particularly, you could have never fathomed that this would be an outcome, but it draws it into our consciousness to say, oh, maybe I hadn't thought of that. And then maybe in future situations when you're taking care of patients, if you're drawing on this knowledge, it affects how you're going to conduct your cancer communication. And I love this. I love the end quote of this. She's referencing how the radiologist explained her cancer to her. And she gave me something that was real in my world. So I thought that was a tremendously evocative statement. So that's just one little example there. And as I told you, I said I'm going to revisit what I said at the beginning about, there's nothing really inherently wrong with methods that draw on, some of the health research that's been conducted in our discipline that, might claim to be a grounded theory or a phenomenological study. And so if anybody remembers the days, I guess not that long ago, when Barbara Walters would be conducting interviews on 2020, I remembered her always saying once that a question that she would always ask that would yield rich answers was, what is the greatest misconception about you? So I decided to put this to the test when I asked Dr. Thorne, what is it that's the greatest misconception that you've ever encountered about interpretive description? And like I said, I'm quite glad that I did. So I'm just going to read an excerpt of that there. That a study claiming to be ID will necessarily look dramatically different from good studies that claim to have used other methods, because it was designed to help people move beyond wrestling with methodological rules from alternative disciplinary perspectives in order to produce good qualitative work. That does not mean people who believe they are doing phenomenology or grounded theory will have done weak work. In many instances, they will have ignored or perhaps not fully understood the methodological tradition and are making the same types of adaptations that I would think would make good sense in order to do work that fits their discipline. In an earlier era, that might have been seen as a fatal flaw with reviewers. But since qualitative work is so much more accessible these days, it may not. So when people say ID is nothing more than grounded theory, what they are meaning is their own version of grounded theory, a normalized version that does not really adhere to the earlier traditions, but uses the common term grounded theory to refer to what I would prefer to call interpretive description. And part of the reason why I prefer that is that, one, so that the author does not get misled into believing that what has been produced is necessarily a theory, and two, so that the author does not get caught up in coding to the extent that interpretation becomes impossible. So when people ask me what distinguishes an ID study from one using any other method, you can see why it's difficult to give an explicit answer, except to say that in the applied world, an ID study done well will have a design logic clearly transparent to an applied audience, who can see how the findings came about and understand why it is that they are important. It doesn't claim to be anything that it isn't. So I love that statement, and it really sort of solidified my understanding and I guess love of this approach, among many other things. If this stimulated your curiosity about ID today, there are a lot of resources out there, and obviously you should always go to the author themselves to get a clear understanding of it. There's a beautiful webinar on YouTube that she conducted, and a lot of what I've presented here today sort of draws on that. The book, as I mentioned earlier, is fantastic. There's a little video where she discusses that provocative editorial. And also there are publications in the literature that sort of more concisely give the Coles Notes version of the approach. And they are wonderful as well. And also just to look at studies that claim to be using an ID approach to see how they frame their questions, what did they find, how did they report and interpret their findings. So these are my references. I think that was a bit of a whirlwind right now. I'd invite, like I said, I full disclosure, I'm not an expert, and I would always refer back to the author if you did, but if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a very good presentation and very informative. Are there any questions? Okay, no questions. So there's some thank yous in the chat.
Rebecca, I have a question, if I may.
Absolutely. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hello. So I'm interested in some of your views with interpretive description. You've talked a lot about it in terms of its qualitative component. Do you have perspectives of how it might also inform mixed method research?
So that's a good question, and I think it can be used, like I think I touched on in the beginning, as a complement to really strengthen, like when you're doing a mixed method study, and like got more to learn about that, but when you really are looking to explain your findings. So maybe there are things that come out in the data that you can get using an interpretive description approach will help you understand that within, like saying, again, if you're using a nursing context to understand it. In terms of the integration, like I have seen it used in some studies as like the qualitative piece of a mixed method, but perhaps of a cross-sectional or something like that. Yeah. Did I get at your question, Jacqueline?
There's another question
Thank
in
you.
chat too.
Oh, thank you.
Says,
Thank you for your question, Jacqueline. Oh, yep. Sorry.
how
Go
do
on.
you plan to carry forward with this approach in your future studies, work beyond your PhD? Any ideas?
Well, I think that I am pretty sold on this method, which probably, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I can't imagine doing anything else in terms of a qualitative method. But I think that any time that I was interested in studying a clinical phenomena, I would be using this method, certainly within nursing, because I just think that it makes tremendous sense and it ensures that the research is going where it's supposed to. And you'll hear in KT talking about that valley of death. I think this method is a really good example of how to avoid that valley of death where our findings stay in our research institutions and never reach the patient. And I think that's tremendously sad. And that's part of the narrative that I think NL support and certainly I can get behind. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Brenda, for the chat too. Brenda and I work together on gynecology.
So
these are some questions. Yeah.
Do you see that question from Mike?
I do, yes. That's a very fair question, and thank you for your question, Mike. I think that if you look, and that's a fair question because you look at like participatory action studies that, you could argue that, really that's a better approach. That's really engagement. But I think that when you consider, you could do a patient-oriented ID study, and I certainly hope to do a patient-oriented ID study that draws on really understanding, like if your motivation is to really impact and help other patients who have experienced this, I think that this method can be used to really get at the heart of that because it does give that subjective voice to the patients. Now, it's not just patients who we would necessarily always be using this method for, but I think if patients are motivated, and certainly some of the ones who I've seen through NL support are really interested in making a difference and really ensuring that human impact is not forgotten in healthcare. So, yeah.
Hi, Rebecca. This is April. I have a
Hi,
quick
April.
question for you.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Very informative and whimsical presentation as usual.
Bloodless findings, April.
Absolutely, I caught that word. So just want to just stretch your mind a bit.
Sure.
And I agree with you totally about the analytical framework.
Mm-hmm.
Given that we're getting into more, intra-professional work,
Mm-hmm.
and working more as teams with different disciplines, how do you see that unfolding with respects to Sally Forlorn comes from a nursing, I guess you could say ontological, epistemological stance with her scaffolding. So how do we merge or blur the disciplinary approaches when we're doing, mixed methods research?
Thank you so much for your question, April. I think I've probably, and I mentioned at the beginning, I've probably presented this in a very nursing lens, and that's because that's what I know. But really, this method has been applied in in HKR. It's been applied in, it's actually been applied in tourism studies. And one of the articles that I referenced is actually about how it's applied in medical education. So it's not, I use the example of nursing, but it's not really just nursing. It's what are your assumptions that you carry from your discipline and how does that affect your purpose of your study? So even though it is rooted in nursing epistemology, even if you look at the even if you look at what the title of the book is, it says for applied disciplines. So I really do think that it lends itself to be used in other, and even just in a broad health sense. I think it makes tremendous sense. Now, perhaps other disciplines may say, no, we need something better for our purposes, but I think it can be applied and very much in an interdisciplinary, to study interdisciplinary phenomena. And I say with yeah.
And I think the findings as well will be very rich because you are getting multidisciplinary perspectives to get the best outcome. So, you know, I think many minds make a good product.
I think that's an excellent point, April.
Rebecca, it's Jacqueline again, if I can interject. I've done two
Absolutely.
interdisciplinary studies using interpretive descriptive. And what's really interesting is working and doing the analysis in an interdisciplinary way helps us to really challenge some of the things that are obscured because of our disciplinary perspective. So I think it makes for a really rich analysis and really rich findings again for the applied disciplines, because our practice now is rarely one discipline. So in terms of the knowledge production, it's quite useful in that perspective. So I think it was a really great question.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's such a good point. And Jack, you remember when we talked that one time, I can't remember who said it, but they said the best work is done at the edge of disciplines. And given that this is being used in a lot of applied health disciplines, I think you're going to see a lot more uptake. And I certainly think it's a palatable method for that. So thank you for that comment and your question, April.
Okay, is there any more questions? I don't think so. So thank you, Rebecca. Do you mind stop sharing your screen for a minute? I just need
Absolutely. Yep.
So I just wanted to let everybody know about our research design series. So our next webinar is on the 22nd with Dr. April Pike. So that's the grounded theory in action. We also have critical appraisal qualitative research on March 29th with Dr. Karen Parsons. If you'd like to register for these events, you go to this link below. So our NL support Eventbrite page. You can also check out past events, slides, and recordings on the website. We also have a free training program, so it's monthly webinars. And if you attend 6, then you will receive a letter of completion. So you can register for this also on our event page. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at my email address here or through the NL Support Facebook. So that's all for me. So I think we're good to go if everyone's has no questions.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.